Hey everyone, it's Charlene. Today we're making this beautiful card using some new products from Honeybee Stamps, and I'm going to be showing you how much fun you can have with pigment ink. I'm starting out here with the wonderful Wishes layering stencils. Now you could use any kind of stencils for the technique I'm using today, but this is an amazing set. It's 6 different stencils. And first I'm going to create my color base. I'm essentially just creating my own colored cardstock here by using some Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide. So I'm going to cover enough of the paper that I know those stencils will fit inside of that colored area. And just to make it easy on myself, to make this go a little bit faster, I'm going direct to paper. So I'm just running that felt pad all the way across the paper until I can see that it is saturated with the color. I let it dry for a little bit, and then I'm bringing in my first stencil. Now this layering stencil set has 2 stencils for the greenery, 3 stencils for the floral layers, and then 1 stencil that covers the candles as well as the cake stand. I'm going to be varying what colors I use, but first I wanted to have some fun here with some pigment ink. So I'm going to be using pigment ink on both of the foliage layers. And so my leaves and all of those little pieces are going to be done with white pigment ink. When you're working with pigment ink, you do want to make sure that your layers are dry before you move on to the next stencil. So I'm doing that with a heat tool. And the reason you want to make sure it's dry is because your next stencil could potentially smudge that pigment ink. Also, I recommend working with some type of foam or pouncing type tool like I am in order to get that pigment ink on there really thick. A brush doesn't tend to work as well and you don't get quite as good coverage. I finished the first 2 layers with the pigment ink, and now I'm bringing in cracked pistachio. The reason I chose to work with Distress Oxides today is because they layer very well, and I know I'm going to get that green color here. Now for the next flower stencil here, I'm actually going to come in first with the white pigment ink again. And you may be wondering, okay, why are you going to do that if you're actually going to use color? Well, a fun technique you can do with Distress Oxides is you can put down a layer of white pigment ink, and then when you come back in with whatever color Distress Oxide you're going to use, it's going to lighten up the ink. So you're going to get a white base underneath that, so it's going to make the color kind of glowy. So we're going to end up with 2 different shades of that green ink now, the cracked pistachio. When I pull this stencil off here, you'll see this second layer is lighter than that first layer. For the third stencil, I'm coming back in with just the straight cracked pistachio, and I went really heavy-handed with this stencil. I really liked how dark the color was coming out, so I decided to go back to the first stencil and just line it back up again and give it another coat of that cracked pistachio as well. So that way there is a very noticeable difference between the cracked pistachio in the first and third stencil versus the cracked pistachio that I used on the second stencil, which had that white pigment base underneath the color. Hopefully that makes sense here as you're seeing it, but I've finished up now. You can see all of the beautiful tones of the green with the blue and the white. Using the coordinating die here to the Wonderful Wishes set, and it's going to cut out this whole stenciled area to create my cake. You can see the set also comes with a cake stand as well as candles that coordinate with the stencils as well. Now I have come in with a white gel pen, and I'm just going to add a few details here and there around on the flowers just to add a little bit more interest and texture to the finished piece. For the cake stand, I'm going to do some dry embossing. So I've set down the stencil, and then I have a piece of foiled cardstock here. Then I have my tan embossing mat and my blue embossing plate. Now, most die cutting machines have some type of setting or sandwich that you can use to do dry embossing with stencils like this. So definitely check out your machine. But now you can see here the stenciled image has actually been impressed into the foil cardstock. Now I'll use the coordinating die to cut it out. You could do it the other way where you cut out the die and then do the dry embossing. You'll retain more of the detail from the dry embossing that way. But with intricate kind of die cuts like this, it's a little harder to do that because you have to make sure it gets lined up just perfectly with the stencil before you run it through. So here you can still see a lot of that detail, all of that fun dry embossing we did there. For my sentiment as well as the candles, I'm using the You're So Extra stamps and coordinating dies. For my sentiment, that's going to go on the front of the card. I've chosen that scripty happy birthday, which is very pretty. Stamping it out here in some intense black ink. I'm going to double stamp it, and I'm only kind of lightly pressing on my MISTI door because I want to make sure to keep those nice fine lines of the script. I'll cut this out with the coordinating die, and off camera I did cut out 2 extra of the die cut in order to layer those up with some liquid glue. Now I'm stamping out the candle. Now there's a couple of different ways you could stamp this candle. You could stamp just the candle without the flame like I'm doing here. I'm going to stamp 3 and then die cut those as well. But there are other stamps in this set where you can stamp the flame, different sizes of flame. You can stamp the stripes on the candles, all kinds of different options. I've cut out a piece of white and black cardstock here, and I'm going to layer these on top of each other so I have a nice thin black border all the way around. And then when this goes on my card base, I'll have a white border around the black border, which will look really nice, kind of tying in with our black sentiment as well as our black stamped candles. So I'm taking the cake piece, the stenciled cake piece, and I'm going to glue it to our cake stand that we created. And then I've put foam tape on the base of the cake stand as well as on the back of the cake. So that way this entire piece is going to be popped up on the front of the card. It is a large cake, so it definitely takes up the majority of an A2 size card. This is going to be a finish size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. So now I can bring in the candles. I'm actually going to trim 2 of them with my scissors. And you can see I did cut out an extra of each of those candles and glue it to the back as well to give these a little bit of dimension too. So my sentiment as well as the candles are just slightly raised off of the card. I kept the 3rd candle longer because I'm going to put that in the center. I wanted it to have a little bit higher on the front of the card. I went ahead and placed everything so I could get a sense of where I wanted it, and then I used my wax tool there in order to pick up those little die cuts and make things a little bit easier on myself before I glue them on there. For this style of scripty sentiment, you could do it on the horizontal, or sometimes I like to do it at an angle where it kind of looks like maybe it's been written naturally in cursive, because I kind of tend to write at that little bit of an angle when I'm writing in cursive. So I did that with a sentiment. I think it looks really nice at a slight angle. Lastly, I'm going to bring in some of the Let's Party gem stickers. These coordinate really well with the greens. They've got a rainbow of sparkly colors there. And now I can attach the entire thing to my card base, and then I'm going to stamp my sentiment on the inside of the card. I'm going to use that same You're So Extra stamp set. And there's this fun little sentiment here where you have check boxes that you can check off, where it says extra special, extra loved, extra awesome. There's a little X you could use. There's a little check mark, which is what I use. And I went ahead and checked off all 3 because Naturally, anyone I'm sending this to for a birthday, I'm sure is all three of those things. So for the little check mark, I went ahead and just used a little acrylic cube here. It made it a little easier than trying to move around that tiny stamp on my MISTI. Now, of course, you could stamp your sentiment inside of your card before you put the card front on, which is probably the better route to go, but I often forget to do the inside of the card until after I've finished off everything else. And sometimes I leave it blank on purpose so that way I can fill in that part later on. So here's the finished card. I love how that pigment ink looks on top of the oxides, how we were able to get those two different gorgeous shades of green. I hope you guys picked up a few tips and tricks today. Please be sure to like and subscribe, as well as hit the notification bell so that you'll know about future videos here on the Honey Bee Stamps channel. I hope you all have a wonderful day.